the presentation today is really summative, and it's joined together two bodies of research I've been involved in over the past 5 or 10 years. One element was in looking at segregation over the long term from 1971, using the grid square resource in Northern Ireland as a whole. The second theme was using the Northern Ireland Longitudinal Study to look at segregation patterns in terms of internal changes of address, migratory moves within Northern Ireland after 2001. And I tried to draw these together to try to give some sort of sense about the way that population might change in Northern Ireland and the way it might operate as a system. Because the basic sort of story is that certainly in the past, Northern Ireland has grown apart, and there was a great deal of population change in the period between 1971 and 1991. But the aggregate census data, the general patterns, and here I'm not making specific comments about specific localities, but the general patterns were that between 1991 and 2001, aggregate population distributions didn't shift so much. And the evidence from the NILS after 2001 is that basically migration was redistributing the population, but not enough to drive major changes in segregation. So it was moving people out, but not enough. So at one historical period, the population was very dynamic and changed a lot. But after 1991, I'll argue the evidence is that it hasn't changed in terms of segregation in general patterns, probably quite that much. And that migration itself, people moving between areas, is actually probably got quite a small role to play in reshaping population and altering the distributions in terms of greater patterns of segregation. I'm looking at, obviously, community background stroke religion as one element, but I also touch upon things like social deprivation and things like individual demographic and social characteristics. For example, have you got education or not? Have you got limiting long-term illness or not? And one point I'd like to make at this stage is that in terms of those characteristics, the population in Northern Ireland moves about in pretty much the same sorts of ways as you see in other parts of the UK and indeed other parts of the world. So some of the patterns I'll show you are actually things you'll see in Scotland and in England and Wales as well. So obviously there are sectarian factors here, and this is a major thing which we cannot discount. But there's also other things happening behind the scenes in terms of social disadvantage, where the population is being moved about and shaped in the same way as in other parts of the world. So in terms of that question there, growing apart or growing together, we're certainly not growing together. So I don't think things are growing together. Certainly grew apart in the 70s, 80s, but probably some sort of stalemate really from 1991 onwards. But we'll have to see where the trajectory of developments, both political and economic and social, will take us in the next 10 years. So, here are some sort of specific questions that I'll try to answer during the course of my talk. First of all, how and why have levels of segregation appeared to remain constant between 1991 and 2001? So, what's going on? Why hasn't the population changed that much? And why did it change a lot in the past? And I'll talk about some candidates for that. Some are quite obvious, so the Troubles in the 1970s, in the early 70s, and forced population moves are obviously a major candidate. But there's other perhaps less obvious candidates to consider. And we have to think maybe about where we are now and where population's going now as well. Why are segregation levels sometimes slow to change in Northern Ireland, and indeed elsewhere in other world areas too, in other countries? So why is often segregation so durable? So segregation is durable in many cities. It's durable in United States cities. It's durable in British cities. So sometimes why is it so durable? So obviously people do move about in Northern Ireland. Why is it, how is it that migration doesn't really move people about in such a way as to affect major changes in population distributions, particularly since 2001, and I would argue really since 1991. Why is that, and in what circumstances can that happen? And what would we have to do if we were looking at things like migration? How would we have to move people, or would people want to move themselves if there were going to be substantial reductions or increases in segregation? to actually affect overall indicators of segregation in Northern Ireland. We wanted to move towards a more mixed society. How would we move people? What sorts of levels of mobility would be required? So I'll try to touch on these things in various parts of the talk as I move on through it. So, by 2001, Northern Ireland was a much more segregated society in residential terms than in 1971. So by 2001, quite clearly, there was a great deal more segregation. Now, contra to some of the coverage that you'd expect and some of the patterns you'd expect from a lot of the coverage, the general patterns of segregation did not increase between 1991 and 2001. So most of the leap, in fact the entire leap in the increase in segregation between 1971 and 2001 took place in that 20-year period between 1971 and 1991. Obviously, with a census, we have a start point and an end point. We don't know the timing of these developments, whether they happened at a linear rate through that 20-year period, whether they all happened at the end, or they all happened at the start. But given what we know about the political developments in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, the late 60s and 70s, and remember we're starting here in 1971, much of the change I would expect happened in the early 1970s, or at least a large part of it. In terms of this research, I'm reporting, this is the first amount of research I'm reporting. It's work I did with Chris Lloyd, who's now at the University of Liverpool. We were using 1 kilometre grid square data and other grid square data from the census. Now, we're very lucky in Northern Ireland, actually, in having grid square data. This was produced in 1971 in the UK as a whole, but was abandoned in England and Wales and Scotland, but the Census Office here in NISRA have kept doing this ever since. And what it means is we're in a very good position at looking at change through time compared to other parts of the UK. Because basically we've got grids, and they're the same at every census. They don't change their boundaries, they don't change their shape. It gives us a pretty good measure to look at population, how it's changed through time. So what were the major things happening between 1971 and 1991 in terms of population? First of all, Belfast lost a large amount of population between 1971 and 1991. It lost a lot of population. Between 1991, as I'll indicate later, and 2001, the population stayed roughly the same. And indeed, the headline figures from the census data release in December is that the population of Belfast has increased by something like 3,000 or 4,000. When I say Belfast, I mean the district council area. So Belfast is actually quite hard to place in official census statistics, because of course the district council doesn't necessarily equate, obviously, to the city. Right? But looking at the Belfast district council area, the population, which is basically the inner core of Belfast, has stayed fairly constant for the last 20 years. Belfast obviously became proportionately more Catholic through time. And that's on the basis, though, of slower decrease or relatively stable population on declining absolute population numbers. So basically, the largest fall was in Protestant populations in the inner city. Those are the areas which saw the biggest population decrease. And in official statistical terms, we don't really know what drove that, whether it's people moving out to places like Newtonards and Carrickfergus and Larne. It probably was, at least in part. And how far it was down to people leaving Northern Ireland altogether, and indeed how far it was down to the different age compositions of the populations as well. Because the Protestant population has historically tended to be older than the Catholic population. As we know, older people sadly die more than younger people, so older populations don't have that demographic momentum behind them. So that was happening in Northern Ireland. And Belfast is the Greater Belfast area is about a third of the population of Northern Ireland. So a lot of what happens in Belfast conditions what's happening in the rest of Northern Ireland. So in Northern Ireland itself, there's a growth in the Catholic share of the population through time as well. So in Belfast and in Northern Ireland. What seemed, when we were looking at the causes of increased segregation through time, was there was a greater spatial concentration of the Catholic population in that 20-year period. So areas that were sort of, 60 or 70% Catholic in 1971 became 90% by 2001, or, by 1991. So it's a concentration of areas which are already Catholic becoming more Catholic. It could well be that a lot of that is down to natural increase, in situ increase. A lot of it could be down to the way housing policies worked out. But anyway, greater spatial concentration of the Catholic population. Now, 1991 to 2001, the Catholic share of the population increased, but it didn't seem to get any more concentrated over where it was in 1991. Belfast didn't change in any dynamic way, Belfast District Council and the wider area in such a dynamic way as it had in the earlier 20-year period. And aggregate indices of segregation didn't shift through time. So we got to sort of a fairly segregated state in 1991, and thereby things stayed. Now, there's questions here of evidence. So this is quantitative, generalised evidence. It doesn't tell you necessarily what's happening in small areas. It doesn't tell you about relationships between interface areas. That's a different sort of evidence, so it's telling you about localities. This is a generalised picture which is giving you the general overall structure. So, the general picture is lots of changes in that 20-year period to start off with, less dynamic changes, that's the wrong sort of phrase, less changes, smaller changes, minor changes after 1991 in general. Now, what's the probable position now? And I'm going to probably make some foolish speculations where I could probably be easily disproved in about 3 weeks' time if I get them wrong. But I'm going to sort of bet that things haven't changed that much, and we'll just have to go and wait and see until the results come out. Of course, the results could become outdated. For example, the political situation changes here, and sort of by next year, the census will be out of date anyway, but we'll see. So what's the probable position now? Where are we now? Well, I got some insights for possible changes after 2001 from using the Northern Ireland Longitudinal Study. This is a 28% sample of the population, so it covers about 450 to 500,000 people. And it's sampled on the basis of you having one of 104 birth dates, which we're sworn not to reveal, and which I don't know even, I couldn't tell you even if I wanted to, because I don't know what the birth dates are. But the odds are, obviously, if it's a 1 in 3 sample, 1 in 4 sample, it's that 28%. Quite a few of us here are probably members of it, but we don't know. The data are accessed in a confidential and secure data lab, precisely because the data are individual. It involves linking data from the census, the 2001 census at the minute, to health cards. So with health card information, we know about births, deaths, we know about people when they change address, if they tell their doctor or other health professionals. And so access to the data is pretty strictly controlled to make sure that nothing is disclosed which will identify individuals. But it's quite a good resource. I mean, 450,000 people, 500,000 people, it's about the same absolute size as the England and Wales Longitudinal Study, which has been running since 1971. So we've got the same absolute size, so we can get the same sorts of analysis in terms of crosstabs without running into small cell sizes. Because Northern Ireland's that much smaller, it's a lot bigger relative sample. But that allows us, because it is like that, to look at things geographically. So 28% sample allows you to start to explore some fairly fine-grained geographies. In terms of where the NILS is going, the 2011 data will be linked and will go live later this year. 1991 census data are being linked and should go live in 2014. And we are trying to extend linkage to other administrative data sources as well, to get a more up-to-date and a better picture of the population. So it's an expanding data resource, and it allows you to do quite a lot of things. Now, in the work that I do with it, this is a second strand of research. I was looking at migration events from 2001 to 2007 from health card registrations. So you're supposed, if you go to your doctor and you've changed an address, you're supposed to tell your doctor that you've moved house. So it's based on that information. And it's probably the best we're going to get within existing constraints. And in the work I was doing, I was looking at people aged 25 to 74. So I was looking at the entire population. I was excluding students because they're a special case. They tend to move to just a few parts of Northern Ireland. so there's quite a skewed sort of geography in terms of their moves. And I've excluded the very old because they tend to move quite often for health-related and care-related reasons, e.g. for specific factors of their own. But in the work I was doing, we were looking at the determinants of people moving between different sorts of places through time over that period. And if you look at it, you think about between 1971 and 1991, that's a 20-year period, and there's quite big changes in segregation. Well, that period there is about a third of that time, span. So it's quite an appreciable fraction of the time span that we're talking about in terms of the earlier research. I'm going to use this to try to indicate some trends about what you might see when the full results are released later in 2013, and to basically offer some comments on about how migration, as we've measured it, is redistributing the population. So here's a couple of charts. The one on the left shows the percentage of people who make no moves, 1 move, 2 moves, and 3+ moves. And about 70% of the population stay where they are. They didn't move in that time period. We're not incredibly mobile. Now, the only data I've got to put that in a wider context is UK data. We're not among the least mobile of all UK regions. The North East and the North West are, I think, less mobile than us. But we're not among the highest in terms of population churn in general. So the South East of England and London would have a lot more churn than, say, Northern Ireland. So a lot of people basically were where they were in 2007, where they were in 2001. Now, a key point to make as well is a distance over which people move. I haven't got this up in a table, but the median distance that people move in Northern Ireland is under 4 kilometres. It's actually 3.58 kilometres. So 50% of people move less than 3.58 kilometres. So a lot of people don't move. A lot of people who move only short distances. Now again, this is not exceptional. In Sweden, where I've been looking at mobility, and in other English and Scottish regions, people don't move about that much. We tend to be towards the lower mobility end of the continuum rather than the higher end of the continuum, but we're not an outlier. So we're pretty immobile, but it's what you'd expect. It seems to be sort of within the experience of other areas. Now, there's something gone wrong with this chart slightly, but this shows the percentage of people who are moving by community background, by the sort of community background of the area in which they're from. And this is where I'll probably lose the mic as I walk away. There's a class of super output areas here, which are 0 to 10% Catholic and 90 to 100% Catholic here. Let's look at the proportion of people who are moving by community background. And the key thing to sort of pick out there, of course, is that people in areas where they're a minority tend to move more. And this is what you'd expect. There's a lot of literature about neighbourhood effects and neighbourhood and how it affects people's migratory, change of address, residential intentions. So people tend to move away from areas where they're different to the majority population. So there's a lot of literature on that in Sweden and the Netherlands. There's literature on that in Scotland. So you see there that people are more likely to change address if they're a minority population. And you must remember that at the extreme ends of the distribution, for example, looking at the proportion, for example, of Protestants, of Protestants in areas which are more than 90% Catholic, is actually quite a small absolute number. So it's at that end of the distribution. Now here's something which is interesting, I think, because these data, right, long time after the peace process is supposed to have got started, after the Good Friday Agreement, it probably shows that things in some ways haven't settled down in sectarian terms in terms of the housing market. So here you have areas again which are 0 to 100% Catholic, right? So here we are, 90 to 100% Catholic. I'm looking here at the average percentage point difference in the religious makeup of the origin SOA and the destination SOA. So what you see here, that in SOAs, which are in the class 90 to 100% Catholic, the Protestants, on average, are going to an SOA which is, what is it, about 25% less Catholic. Whereas Catholics are just going to somewhere which is a little bit less Catholic. Now, there's obviously sort of ceiling here and cellar effects. If you live in somewhere which is sort of like, 95% Catholic, it's pretty hard to move to a more Catholic place. If you live in somewhere which is 95% Protestant, 5% Catholic, it's pretty hard to move to a more Protestant sort of place. Now here's just a couple of charts which aren't looking at sectarian stuff, and these are the patterns that you'd actually expect to see in Scotland, England and Wales, or wherever. In Northern Ireland, people tend to move away from deprived areas. They tend to move to less deprived areas. And people with better characteristics, more favourable characteristics, individual characteristics in deprived areas are more likely to move out. So the overall effect of migration is actually to sift the population in such a way that disadvantaged people tend to become more disadvantaged in disadvantaged areas. So this is what's happening in Northern Ireland, it's happening in other areas. So in this case, we'll just look at this one here. This is the deprivation decile, so these are the most deprived super output areas. What are the odds of moving to one of the less deprived deciles, of getting out of decile 10? Well, it's far higher if you've got any sort of educational qualification at all, compared to somebody who's got no qualification. Whereas you're slightly more likely, if you've got no qualifications, to be moving down the scale towards more deprivation. So Northern Ireland's got the same sort of problems, the same issues as you see in the literature in Scotland and elsewhere. So this is a feature where Northern Ireland has got the same migratory system, the same patterns as elsewhere. Everything else being equal, migration tends to concentrate people, deprive people in deprived areas. And we see the same thing elsewhere. Now this is a bit more complex and a bit harder to explain. But basically this looks at the odds of moving for this lighter column here to a more Protestant area on that side, and a more Catholic area on that side, and to a more deprived area on this side, and a less deprived area on this side. And what it does is to try to describe moves which start and end in the same decile, or moves which take you across a lot of deciles in terms of space. So here is decile 9. So this is people, right? This is a decile shift 9. It's people who've moved from the least deprived sort of class of SOA to the most deprived. It's like moving from Malone or Stormont to Shortstrand or somewhere like that. It's people moving a long way through social space, through deprivation space. And you can see there aren't many moves that far. Migration isn't moving people a lot through deprivation space. Most moves tend to be clustered around here, -2 to +2. So people are broadly moving between areas which are pretty much similar or not too different from where they started out. Now the darker column is in terms of multiple deprivation, right? The lighter column is in terms of community background. The thing to note there, and the difference is that people don't move. When they do leave the decile of their sort of origin, they don't go to a very different area in terms of religious stroke community background. But look how many more people have moves that start and end in the same type of decile, who don't affect any move. It's zero change in terms of community background. it's far more in terms of religion, stroke community background, than in terms of deprivation. So migration, people aren't that mobile and go to very different areas with regard to social background and deprivation. But they're even less likely to move to very different sorts of areas in terms of community background. The population is more sticky in terms of community background than in terms of deprivation, though it's pretty bloody sticky probably, in both respects as well. So, interpretations, and I've got an eye on the clock. Migration, if you look at the population before and after moves, didn't really change the population that much. It didn't really alter it that much. The evidence we got is that social background and community background remain important. And everything else being equal, they'll lead to greater differentiation. But basically the position we've got is that there's not enough migration over long distances to really shift the population and lead to greater segregation either in community or sectarian terms or social terms. So it's a sort of stalemate. The population isn't moving about that much. Now, the good thing is that things, quotes, aren't getting worse, that polarisation isn't increasing. The bad thing, though, is there's stalemate, and that migration, at the minute, isn't acting to reduce communal segregation or to really mix the population in social terms either. So it's not leading to greater mixing either. So the bad news is that there's small factors which suggest that there's differences, and migration's helping to perpetuate those. The good news is it's not really increased segregation through time after 2001. But the bad news is it's not really changing the population in the way of greater mixing. Migration of the sort we've seen since 2001 will not mix the Northern Ireland population substantially. Now, I'm trying to sort of speculate as to reasons why that's the case. One, not many people move. We're not exceptionally immobile, but we're at the lower end of the migration continuum, the mobility continuum. Most people only move short distances. And migration, in this sense, Northern Ireland is basically pretty much like other parts of the world, other parts of the UK, but at the lower end of the continuum. But one thing I think that's important is the existing structure of the population that we've already got. The population's already fairly structured by community background. It's already in fairly big chunks in terms of segregation, outside Belfast in particular. And it's already in fairly big chunks, though probably less so when compared with community background in terms of social deprivation. So short distance moves in many parts of Northern Ireland, everything else being equal, will start and end in roughly the same sort of place. Or there's a fairly good chance of them doing so anyway. It's like the old sort of joke, you know, if you're trying to get desegregation and mixing the population, you wouldn't want to start from here, with the population already in fairly big chunks, particularly in terms of community background. Short distance moves of the level that we're seeing just won't sort the population that much. So for the last 20 years, I think we've had a fairly stable state in terms of migration, in terms of population. The population isn't that dynamic. But it has changed in the past. I mean, quite clearly we've got to where we are, and the position where we're in now, because of changes in the past. And it does seem that the population, at some times, is highly unstable, and it's highly dynamic. Now, the big increase, the last big increase was in the period 71 to 1991 in segregation, but there were others before in the 1920s. And this is fairly well known. So we have the segregation ratchet, in which there are upsets, political upsets, which are again followed by stability. For the past 20 years, we've been in a period of relative stability. Whether we remain in it is another matter, really. Bowell termed these as ethno-national earthquakes, so partition, the start of the Troubles in the late 60s. And they could move enough people over long distances to restructure population on the ground, rather than for moves, just to move people about at a small scale within existing population structures and geographies. As I said, we're actually quite light on what we know about some of these things in some respects. I mean, other factors may be important besides politics. So, for example, in the loss of population of Belfast, it wasn't unique in that. It was unique in terms, perhaps, of the violence that it had experienced, but it wasn't unique in terms of the processes of manufacturing job loss, of urban renewal and clearance, of the way that planning policy was working in the 1970s. And it's a time when cities all over Europe and the United States were losing population. And one thing we don't know very much about, and we could maybe do some work on with the NILS, is to think about other components of population change, such as births and deaths. So I've only looked at migration, but to actually really understand how population is changing, you need to look at in situ increase and decrease, the excess of births over deaths or vice versa, as well as the redistribution effects of migration. So what are the implications? Well, I bet there'll be no major increase in segregation between 2001 and 2011, when the full results come out. Or else, if there is an increase, it's probably not down to migration, it's probably down to births and deaths, natural increase and decreases in situ. But I don't think migration's had a big part to play. And my bet, if I was a betting man, would be that segregation levels probably haven't changed much in the last 10 years. Opinion surveys suggest there's a preference for mixed neighbourhoods, mixed communities, for mixing in residents. But the evidence we've got tends to suggest that in some ways, Catholics and Protestants still tend to move to different kinds of places. But the effect isn't big enough to really increase segregation markedly. Like everywhere else in the world, migration tends to sort people by socioeconomic status, with poorer people tending to remain in or move to poorer areas. And this is going to be a challenge for us, like everywhere else, in terms of trying to develop deprived areas, if they're always being topped up with more deprived people moving into them, of trying to ensure social mobility. The overall outcome is that existing levels of migration don't seem to offer greater residential mixing either by religion or social background. And that if you were seriously interested in integration and mixed communities, it would take quite an effort to achieve that aim, because existing levels of migration and the way that people move at the minute aren't enough to change patterns of population sufficiently. So, I think those have really sort of finished the substantive points I wanted to make. I mentioned the 1991 and 2011 link. That will give us a 20-year perspective on some of these developments, and will allow us to trace Northern Ireland in the transition from conflict to peace. And I think apart from that, thanks very much.